Уважаемые коллеги, всем доброе утро.
Dear colleagues, a very good morning to everyone. I welcome everyone who's found enough force left in himself or herself to take part in the plenary session of the second day. I hope that the second day of our conference is going to be of no less interest to you than the first one, and we'll start with a comparatively new topic on our agenda. Why new? Because, well, we've been trying to deal with this for a couple of years in a row, but why it's new? Because if we look at the history of the Russian financial market development, if we start by 89 or 90, this topic is a new one. Ethics, behavioral oversight, something that adds up to prudential regulation and what creates trust in our financial market. Our financial market, as any financial market, cannot exist without the trust. The trust is the soul of the financial market, because the main objective is the consumer satisfaction, is customer satisfaction, and that's what we give them utmost importance. And trust has been outlined as one of the fourth major directions. I'd like to introduce now our speakers, and let me also kick off the discussion. Tiago Aguiar, who represents the Central Bank of Portugal. He does oversight over the financial sector, and we looked at various jurisdictions, and the Portugal experience is an interesting one for us, and the actual structure of the Portugal market is very similar to the Russian one. Georgy Lontovsky, he needs no introduction. He heads one of the Banks Association of Russia. They take about 3/4 of the Russian market, and every time we mention the financial market, we actually mean banks. Mikhail Mamuta, he's the head for Service for Consumer Protection and Financial Inclusion, the Bank of Russia. That's the department that is responsible for the oversight, ethical oversight, and they also produce methodologies and they apply things. Igor Yurgens, he represents the Insurance Association. He's the head of almost all insurance associations here in the market, including the All Russian Insurance Association. And the insurers for the last couple of years have achieved significant results when it comes to self-regulation. We see that the number of claims when it comes to the insurance business goes down, and largely this dynamics is due to the fact that the central bank and the insurance community have undertaken a significant amount of efforts. We also have some front row participants. Sergei Belyakov. Happy to introduce you to him. He is representing non-governmental funds. Sergei Ugrumov represents the National Association of Non-Governmental Pension Funds. Vasily Zablotskov and Alexei Timofeyev, they are the ones representing brokers, dealers, managers, security market participants association, and so on and so forth. So everything that has to do with securities. Alexander Solomkin is also here, the front row. He is from the Corporate Finances Cooperative. Yelena Stratina from the Russian Microfinance Center, and Andrei Yazykov, who is a leading researcher and an employee of the Financial University and the government of the Russian Federation. So he is the theoretician. He will provide a theoretical outlook. And the first part of our discussion will be about the ethics. It will be about trust and building it. Cooperation and collaboration with the consumer sets up his expectations regarding the products that he or she buys, and these expectations, they are either met or not met. And when the consumer buys, thanks to dealing with a financial institution, some uplifted expectations, he might be discouraged when the products do not meet the demand. And this discouragement raises the issue of trust, because a discouraged consumer will report his discouragement to his neighbor to the left and to the right, and this lack of trust hinders the penetration of financial services and hinders its development and growth, and also hinders us on the way to growth. My first question is to Georgy. Banks is everything here. Now, what's your take on the actual relations between the banks and the consumer? Well, first and foremost, I would like to thank the organizers and Sergei here for the opportunity to take part and to speak at the Financial Congress here. The existence of the banking system itself is based on trust. Both active and passive operations are based on trust. And the level of trust towards the banking sector today I would characterize as a growing one. And a high one as well. Of course, for credit organizations of utmost importance is the establishment building of trust. If there is no trust, the costs are growing for credit organizations, investments are halted, and the whole economy suffers. In my presentation, I would like to give you two cases where the governmental actions trigger changes in the trust level. Let me start with the crisis of 1998. When the state has announced default, I was not yet an employee of the central bank, but I was a witness to it. The first queues in front of the offices appeared at one of the largest banks of Russia, the savings bank, and only thanks to the regulator we managed to restore business as usual. The second example that I would like to give to you, and the second case I would like to talk to you that demonstrates how government can influence trust, is when the law on deposit insurance, banking deposit insurance, was adopted. When the law was adopted, 1st of January 2003, the total share of deposits in the central bank by the population is 69%. Today, this figure is 44%. You can see that the production and the acceptance of this law not only strengthened the trust towards other credit organizations, but it allowed them to compete on the same footing with large and governmentally backed up banks. Now, a few words about the role of the regulator when it comes to raising the trust towards the banking system. I believe that the actions currently undertaken by the Bank of Russia in the recent years, cleansing of the banking sector from bona fide players, the players who violate the legislation, as well as the extension of its requirements towards corporate governance in commercial banks, proportionate oversight, behavioral oversight, and other measures contribute to building a more trustworthy environment. Yesterday, I took part in the plenary session, a session about the regional banks, and I need to say that for the first time in many years, I heard from the regional banks, from the small players here in the market, that they have no questions posed to the regulator regarding the reduction of the regulatory measures. What the banks were happy about is that a dialogue was instituted and this dialogue was sustained. We also discussed the same issue with the large banks, and all the banks note that there's been a positive shift when it comes to relations between the banks and the regulator. And I think this also contributes to a more trustworthy environment. One should also note the role of the banks themselves, because they're the ones mostly interested. They're the beneficiaries of having a trustworthy environment, because it only helps them to attract more clients. This element of trust helps banks to grow. It helps competition to become more active in the banking sector. And the banks do a lot to support the movement. I would also like to mention another trend that has already been mentioned by Elvira Nabiulina before the first plenary session. New modern technologies have entered our life. The banks are now creating platforms and ecosystems. And it's important that the regulator understands the opportunities that lie in front of smaller banks today. And what the central bank does now is making various platforms more available to us. And they want to make the life of commercial banks easier by providing them more opportunities and tools for monitoring various lending risks, especially if we are lending to small and medium enterprises. Various actions of this kind once again contribute to building a more trustworthy environment. Many banks, especially the large ones, those with means, have claimed recently that they are going to launch their own ecosystems. It makes the client come closer to the bank. The client now gets better service and faster service with the bank, and many clients stop visiting banking offices, which I also believe is a positive trend because it helps you to save time and money. Now, the fact is that the trust towards banks is growing. As an evidence to this, for the last couple of years, the overall amount of deposits placed by the population into the bank has grown. The growth is about 1 to 2 trillion rubles on an annual basis, and today 29 trillion rubles is the overall amount of deposits into banks. Now, when it comes to major development areas, when the Bank of Russia published its strategy, they offered their own indicator to measure the level of trustworthiness, a composite index of satisfaction. And until May 2018, starting from the year before, this index has grown by 10%, from 41 to 51. But the target is 100, so they have to go from 0 to 100, and 100 is the maximum mark. It means that both us and the regulator have a lot to do in order to continue to improve the level of trust in the market. Thank you. Thank you. I don't think that trust is enough between the consumer and the financial institution. There has to be trust between financial institutions, between the mediators and the central bank, because it is definitely very important for the central bank to have an authority to respect, to have a respect to what they do, so that they could live by the rules. My question to Tiago now. The Bank of Portugal have recently adopted a code of ethics for their employees and for the board of directors. Now, how does this code work? What was done for, and which kind of the benefits and results do you already see today? How did it improve the market and because of that code? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. I would like to start by thanking Bank of Russia for the kind invitation to participate in this event. Sorry, it was echoing. I would like to greet all the present and particularly my colleagues from the panel, and to say that that's right, we have issued and approved the Code of Ethics for the Central Bank of Portugal's internal employees. For our staff, it was approved in 2014. It follows the ECB standard because we are part of the Euro system, so we have to have that code. And the code also addresses another relevant issue, which is that Bank of Portugal has a series of functions, not only in market currency supervision, but also in prudential supervision, macro-prudential supervision, resolution. So it is also the oversight authority for payment. So we have a lot of functions, relevant public functions, and we have to have high standards for the staff. And following that question, we adopted the Code of Ethics. We also established an ethics committee, which is responsible for the oversight of the compliance with that code, and also a compliance officer, which is responsible for the execution of the code. The code has several requirements, such as, for instance, the gifts that are given to the staff. It establishes a threshold above which staff members cannot accept presents. We also have standards for working abroad with other entities. We cannot have shares from banks. We cannot own shares from banks or for other financial entities, and we have to declare or at least authorize the compliance officer to check our accounts to see if we comply with that regulation. So it's quite intrusive for the staff employees. It started by being only, this rule started by being only applicable to the staff involved in supervision, resolution, market conduct, prudential, macroprudential, and it's becoming applicable to everyone. And there's another code for the board members, and another one for the senior staff. So I guess that it is important, like you said, Mr. Vice Governor, to have these high standards and to be compliant with them, because it shows not only to the banks but also to the public, because we are a public service, we have to address that we act on a neutral, impartial way to do our job.
А как вы меряете эффективность? Вот какие метрики?
How do you measure the efficiency? Which metrics does the Bank of Portugal use to understand whether the code of ethics works or doesn't work, whether the system works or doesn't work? Are you doing questionnaires for the participants of the market, or the Parliament somehow expresses its position? So how do you assess the efficiency of using this code?
Actually, the Ethics Committee delivers every year a report to the board, and the compliance officer does the same. We have it is a small committee. It has 5-6 persons. We are obliged as staff to report to that committee any pending issue that might be under their oversight. But there's no, I would say that there's no external echo of that activity. We are also obliged to report some activities, mostly those that are connected with, for the staff that is involved in the SSM, and the single supervisory mechanism of the ECB, the prudential and macroprudential staff, to report any breach of the compliance code to the ECB, and that's it.
Okay. Спасибо. У меня такой вопрос.
Thank you. I have the following question. Now, we understand that trust and ethics are intertwined, but introduction of those rules and codes require certain costs and expenses. How do our front row speakers assess the feasibility of such costs? Do you think that raising the trust justifies these expenses? For creating KPIs and controlling the KPIs, do we have a position to voice? Andrei, may we start from you, please? Naturally, such tools and instruments are important and are needed, and they do change the market. Let's take the mortgage situation. In 2009, when we suffered from the world financial crisis, many lenders were not capable of paying out their interest payments and mortgage rates. Many decided to sell off the real estate because they didn't know what will happen next. In the West, the situation is different. You have to give the lenders time, and they will start loving their banks after it. So you can't rush. In 2018, the situation have radically changed, and the bank has finally managed to establish a good, solid dialogue with their lenders. But it gave a significant impetus to the mortgage lending, and now we see that the gap is becoming ever so wider. As soon as people feel that the attitude from the financial market towards them changes, it gives a significant breakthrough for the market. Thank you. What else can the front row, well, what else will can the participants of the market do and the Bank of Russia in order to increase the trust? Is there anyone volunteering to speak? Sergey, please. Yes, thank you very much. I think that trust is a multifaceted term. You have to first define who has to trust whom, and here I can only agree with Georgi. I don't think there's the lack of trust from the banking sector towards the Bank of Russia and the way they make their decisions. I think the spotlight has to be given to us. I think we need to build the trust towards the market. And there has to be trust towards the central bank and towards the players in the market and the practices we promote our products with. I know that it's going to sound as a provocation quite often when there's a competition between non-bona fide practices and bona fide practices. The non-ones are winning because it's easier to get access to a customer through certain bad malpractices. It's cheaper, and that's why we need to promote bona fide behavior and punish the bad behavior. And I think the market has to decide how to punish those who's doing bad practices, and the punishment has to be harsh. First, we have to identify those, then a sanction should follow, then the correction measures have to be taken. And if the correction measures are not undertaken, then of course the player has to be excluded from the market. I think it's the norm that the regulator has to pursue, and the market has to take that responsibility on itself. Because if oversight is a function, then if you are ready to take more functions to yourself in the framework of the self-regulating market, then this function should also be undertaken. And of course, we want the players to expand the range of good practices in the market, and we want the self-regulating organization to be a leader when it comes to counteracting bad practices, malpractices. A will and a wish is good, but that's not enough. You also have to grow competences, both in the market and in the banking and financial organizations. Of course, if we compare our competences with the competences that the regulator has, we don't have them enough. Thank you.
It will be naive to think that the market will self-organize and build its ethical norms and create an ethical relationships with all of the customers. We remember the Marxist phrase that the promise of 200% of an annual return erodes all sort of morale. Mikhail, can you elaborate on what has been done and what will be done in the upcoming years in terms of promotion bona fide financial behavior in the relationship with the customers? Thank you for the question and thank you for this opportunity. I'm happy to share the experience we've had in building ethical relationship, and I'm also happy to note our shared vision of trust with the market participants. Behavior surveillance and control is a mechanism that not only prevents or punishes malpractices, but it also changes relationships. We based on the assumption that only client-oriented companies, only companies that practice bona fide approaches receive our support and will therefore receive competitive advantages. Now, as we move towards more and more openness, any malpractice becomes known very fast and can threaten trust and other market parameters significantly. Our mechanism of behavior surveillance has started 2 years ago. Recently we adopted the standards, and now Russia's central bank follows these standards and regulations that we've adopted. The main feature of this is that it's trying to evaluate and manage risks. Therefore, we target market sectors in which risks for the consumer are higher. We implemented this risk targeting last year, and to put it simply, it works as follows. We check how many complaints a player has versus how many contracts they have. We also do that per sector and compare it to the rest of the peers, if that's a company, or to the rest of the sector. And this allows us to rank the player or the sector as above or below the average risk. Those who behave better than the market, who have really invested into building trust with the consumer, then they don't receive any control from us. But if we see that there is a player that receives twice as many complaints, then we will, of course, focus our attention on these specific players, because this means that they have some serious malfunctioning in their sales, in their practices, in their management of complaints. All of this creates the way in which consumers perceives this company. And we will, of course, want to move to discover the reasons for these behaviors and consult companies on how they could improve. I'm also happy to know that most companies we've consulted see this as a positive development. They, of course, don't want to receive excessive workloads from us, but in order for that to happen, you have to manage and prevent your complaints. Last year, in the first 6 months of this year, we've seen significant progress, which is best described through the dynamic of complaints. Before last year, we were seeing an increase in the number of complaints in both loans and other sectors. Last year, there was a small decrease. The data for 5 months of 2019, we see another 3% decrease, and our estimate for 6 months sees a continuation of this trend, and we see that all players are part of this turn, perhaps unfortunately for the microcredit businesses. If you look at the specific points that we check in our preventive surveillance, then the drop in number of complaints is even more significant. We also track high risk group with a much stronger focus. The model, of course, will develop. We are not yet happy with the results because there are complaints in the market and we receive hundreds of thousands of them per year. And a change in the trends, this kind of dynamic, doesn't necessarily mean that we are doing a good job. We want to achieve the most comfortable and secure situation for the end consumer possible. We will be building our consultative function in the countries of Thinkernet. This is the organization of central banks that puts at its focus consumer rights. These countries now discuss product governance. In the current approach, we track the results of violations. In product governance, it starts with a preemptive evaluation by the organization itself of the perceived product behavior on the market, how beneficial it will be for the consumer, and how this can be evaluated and ranked. We will be offering this model to the market quite soon in order to work this methodology through in order to see how this can work in the Russian market, but I think that this will be a great tool to reevaluate your own performance and to compare it to the expectations of the regulator. Perhaps in the future, after the pilot run, this can be passed on to the activities of the self-regulating associations and organizations. We would also be changing the way in which we consider complaints. Now, consumer has to address their complaint to the company first before the complaint goes to the ombudsman or Bank of Russia or what have you, because frequently the company is not aware of the complaint or of the problem. So we will analyze first, because we've only had the ombudsman for a month or so, and we believe that this could really cut down the amount of work we have to do in surveillance, and it will streamline the actual procedure for complaining. We also hope that this can be regulated rather than controlled. This is what we see in car insurance, a great success there. We also want to do a similar, to implement a similar solution in other sectors of the market. Recent legislation that is trying to introduce the new procedure of relationship between the consumer and the provider of the financial service through the procedure of evaluation, upon which they check that the consumer understands the risks and the mechanisms employed in the product or service that he or she is buying. Another innovation is the standards that we're trying to introduce, upon which we can benchmark and create an evaluations for the new products. For the upcoming year, we will be creating 30 such standards that will be available for all segments of the mass market, and we are already doing it, and we're doing this together with the market. The sets of documents will be available freely, and we also been doing a great deal of work in loans, in collective insurance. We will be introducing the so-called cool-down period for them. Soon this will be part of an amendment. It's already at the Duma, and this will give the opportunity to the individual or the group to retrieve their participation in the insurance scheme if they realize they don't need it. Another innovation which is questionable, where you are offered a so-called a service that is shipped to you as if it were an mandatory part of the service, although it is in fact optional. So you have to, remove the tick here and there, and the customer is not always aware of the whether it's optional or mandatory. This is a long-term game, of course, and we're playing it strategically, and we, I think, should work on this together. The results that we see today demonstrate that we can work productively, that we share the understanding of the problems that exist, and I hope that we remain in tight cooperation for achieving future results. Thank you. I'd also like to address a similar question to Tiago. You have been having the control schemes comparable to the ones that we have here for a while. Now you want to control the digital channels. How has your experience been? Do you see that you've been helping? Do you see the financial sector in Portugal actually follow your advice and abide by the rules?
Thank you for the question. Well, it is a fact. We have some of these approaches implemented for at least for a couple of years. Some of them since the beginning, since 2008, namely the complaints handling and the ranking of and the disclosure of a ranking of complaints, because we disclosed the name of the entities of the institutions that have more complaint annually and yearly in our reports. But let me start from the beginning, just to clarify that we don't have the same remit than Bank of Russia, which would just look for banking sector. We're only responsible for conduct supervision regarding the activity of credit institutions, financial companies, payment services, payment institutions, and e-money institutions regarding deposits, credit products, payment services, and e-money. That's it. No insurance, no capital markets. That's for our colleagues from the Securities Commission and Insurance Authority. Central Bank of Portugal, the task of conduct supervision was assigned to it in 2008, and we are lucky because the government gave us a lot of powers to do that. We have regulatory power, a very powerful tool in terms of transparency, information, and rules of conduct. We establish rules of conduct based on the law. We have general principles, and then we can execute them. The same for information requirements. We have a lot of information requirements, Michael knows it, from every product has specific features, from deposits to consumer credit, mortgages, payment services. We have standardized information sheets for every product, for pre-contractual information, contractual requirements, post-contractual requirements as well, statement of accounts for credits and for accounts. So it's a quite comprehensive framework that we have in Portugal. The same rules of conduct. We're now exploiting, since 2018, law also grants us power to analyze product oversight and governance arrangements, that one of the topics that Miguel mentioned. And we had also the power to prohibit or to suspend the marketing of products if we find that some of that those arrangements, those product oversight arrangements were not fulfilled, and there's a possible consumer detriment arising from that. And we also have oversight powers, which are also very powerful, to repeat myself. We have a set of different tools for oversight. We do off-site inspections. We analyze every advertising campaign that is public. We do also, because we have a capped rate regime, we monthly receive all the information from banks regarding the interest rates that are being practiced in the market for consumer credit, in order to allow us to establish quarterly the capped rate for consumer credit. And further to that, we do inspections on banks, off-site inspections, on-site inspections, mystery shopping inspections, which is, I know it is, it also always does some, at least some surprise to other colleagues, because it is a powerful tool. It allows us to go to the branches to check how the employees, the staff is selling the product, the credit, the deposit, check if they are providing the correct information, if they are not doing some mis-selling in order to get a fringe benefit from themselves. So we have this set of tools, and we also have another one, which is the complaints handling. And I would like to highlight this one, because it is, for us, a supervisory tool as well. Likewise, like the inspections, the mystery shopping, it is an inspection, a supervisory tool. And a very powerful one, because we know from advance what is happening in the market. And if we analyze the complaint timely, we can understand what's happening and we can predict what will happen to that bank. And what are the practices of that bank, and then we can act timely, which in supervision is the most important, I guess. And we analyze complaints directly. We don't have, some countries have that model. For instance, Spain has the model that the client should first address to the institution, and only if the institution doesn't accept his complaint, he can go to the central bank. In Portugal, he can complain directly, and he can complain from anywhere. We have this complaints book, which is every branch must have. It's not only for the financial sector, but to all sectors, to restaurants, coffee shops, anything. It is mandatory to have one complaints book. And clients may also present complaints through the internet, through our website, through the electronic complaints book, so a lot of instruments. And we are, at the time, we are very committed to new areas of intervention. As I mentioned, last year there was an amendment to the banking law that gave us new areas of intervention. The first one I've already mentioned, it is product oversight and governance. Another one, very important, is regarding the incentives, sales incentives to the staff. This is, I would say, one of the most important aspects to prevent conflicts of interest between companies and their clients. We're at the beginning. We will ask the market to give us what are the practices. We have to analyze those practices. We only have in the law a general principle that says that banks must have a remuneration policy that does not jeopardize the consumer's interest. That's it, more or less this. So we have plenty of room to elaborate on this. There's also some guidelines issued by the European Banking Authority that we must also take into account. But I guess that it will be the work for this year and for the following year. Another topic which is relevant for us, it's also related with sales staff, and it's about their knowledge and competence, that's it. And we have started by establishing some standards for knowledge and competence for sales staff involved on the selling of mortgage credit. Because there's a European directive that says that they should have some specific skills, and we have established a certification process for training entities that are certified by us. That they will give courses to the bank staff. They should pass those courses. They should have a qualification, and that's only the staff that has that course can sell mortgage credit. We had this transitional period that's ended on March that allows people with experience, with 3 or more years of experience, to continue selling those products, but it stopped. We're now overseeing if banks are complying with this requirement. So there's a lot of room for work, and we are also seeing the new digital channels, but I don't want to occupy much time.
Спасибо. Mis-selling.
Mis-selling is one of the bad behavioral practices here in the market, but unfortunately quite an often one as well. Very often we hear a question, why does mis-selling happen in the market? And there are 3 answers to it. First, because it helps you to make more sales. Because your neighbors do the same. And actually, everybody believes that they do mis-selling better than the others. That's why when we talk to the markets regarding mis-selling, we are quite often opposed due to a very strange paradigm, because every organization believes that they are better at mis-selling than others. That's why if we just all undertake to stop doing mis-selling, we will improve the situation. And the third thing why people do it, because they think that nothing is going to happen to them for it. because some of the KPIs are very short term. And this is an action that helps you to raise your sales. And if you're not being punished for it, it causes a significant issue. So that's why we have to cover all three areas here. We don't want mis-selling to be a general practice. We don't want the KPIs to stimulate mis-selling. Actually, we want the KPIs to annul your bonuses and compensations if a mis-selling has been used. And third, of course, we want to make sure that people are being punished for it. Unfortunately, the majority of the products still are being sold through banking chains. And our credit organizations run large retail networks, and of course there's always more trust to a human behind a counter. Irrespective of various negative practices that we've faced in recent years, when a client comes to a bank office, he believes that it's not a cheat. A bank office is a stable institution and it is trustworthy. After looking at a number of various products, after creating the standards of self-regulation in, say, compulsory life insurance, it turned out that the sales are mainly done through banking chains and banking networks, and the banks do not abide by the rules that the insurers set up. That's why we offered the banking self-regulated organizations to sign an agreement, and it was signed, so that the banks have their own sales standards that would satisfy insurance companies, broking companies, and so on and so forth. And such a standard has been written. Recently, it has also been adopted by the Association of Banks of Russia. So my question is the standard being implemented right now? Have the market practices changed because of the standard and its availability now in the market? Georgi, the question goes to you. Thank you very much, Sergey, for the question. It is the first example of our voluntary self-regulation when our association initiated, the initiative of commercial banks adopt certain standards. Truly, at the last forum, we signed a memorandum, an MOU, and again, the initiative came from your side. We've agreed with the self-regulating organizations that based on the MOU, we will produce a standard to counteract malpractices. The standard was produced. What we used as a benchmark and reference are the standards that our self-regulating organizations already had, so that we're not conflicting with some of the existing regulations. Of great support was the info letter that the Bank of Russia published and sent, which of course raised the interest towards the standard. But when adopting the standard, we haven't heard any objections to the standard. The standard was adopted unanimously. After the info note, the info letter was published, we received a lot of requests from the insurance companies because they were interested to get to know which banks have joined the community of those who ascended to the standard. We received lots of responses from the commercial banks, but I can't really say that the results are impressive. One of the first banks that adopted the standard is the Tinkoff Bank. However, after doing consultations and negotiations with the commercial banks, we've come to the conclusion that, unfortunately, we still see a little bit of pendulum going on. In certain cases, the banks are still swinging and are not yet ready to jump on the bank wagon. Some say that they are not given enough time to adopt and integrate their standards and rules and procedures to the new standard. Factoring in these requests, in the end of June, we organized the voting procedure, and now some changes have been adopted. After joining in, the banks have 3 months to coordinate their internal procedures, rules, and regulations with the new standard. As the result of that work, yesterday we published some additional information on our website. As a consequence of our new actions, the biggest bank, Sberbank, have decided to join and sign in to the standard. Many banks mark that the bona fide behavioral principles are already deeply rooted in their daily activities. The request to prepare the standard was initiated by the banks. Some of the commercial banks' position was ardently and quite colorfully formulated by one of our participants, a banker and a professor, who said the following: "Nobody signs off to Christ's commandments. You don't need to sign them off to comply with the commandments, right?" So that's exactly what he told about the standard here. Talking about the future, I don't think there is no other way to make sure that the standard is adopted by everyone but a case-by-case work and a bank-by-bank approach. Yes, the ethics, the public will, the will of the banks to take on the rules of the games. That's all okay, but without the regulator, you can't do it. It all seems nice and great. You can introduce the behavioral oversight. Of course, they're going to be cost, but at least the train will go with the speed that will finally lead us to the necessary level of trust. Let's talk about that. When it comes to insurance, there is some level of self-regulation. Can you give your take on whether it makes sense to continue doing it? Do you think that there's fruit to this labor, or do you think that we should better use the Russian way, when you force everything, when you make everybody follow? Thank you very much, Sergey, for giving finally the floor to the insurers. Because there's only a little bit of time left before the break, I will fill in the gap, since we were given a reference to quite a lot of time. First, I cannot but come back to the issue of trust, not only between the insurers and the insured, but also between the government and the producers of services. During day zero and during yesterday, an organization called Lemonade was mentioned a couple of times. It's a startup that was established in Israel 2 years ago from scratch. And last year, as far as I know, has been sold off for $500 million. The startup, Lemonade, what it does, it regulates an insurance service in just 3 seconds. Imagine you have a car, you are in a car crash, and you have your compulsory car insurance. In 3 seconds, you're going to have your money back. How could it have happened? Now, the insurer that bought this startup has an established database of customers, and they know that these customers have a fair and frank credit history. 3 seconds, if we trust you, if you're in the green zone, we give you the money. If you're in the yellow zone, if you're not very well familiar, it will take it will take some time for you to get your money. If you're in the red zone, you will wait for your money for a couple of years. So trust takes years to build. Every time you measure trust towards the insurers, and of course the financial university measures this trust and other universities, is mainly based on how well you trust a brand. Of course, you can't give reference to companies here, but I will do it nevertheless, because I want my argument to be backed up by some solid data. Until today, the biggest trust was to Gosstrach and Ingosstrach. These are the two brands of the insurance companies. You know how many years it took to build this trust? 90 years. That's why being in a rush is not a way to go. You need to establish a good track record. So the insurer needs to follow and keep the track of the insured, and the consumers themselves have to keep the track of the insurance companies. 20 years, I think, is enough. Because it takes that time to see who goes up and who goes down. Now, the second side of the story. Imagine, in 3 seconds, without any documents presented, you pay how much? 400,000 rubles? if you're using the compulsory insurance policy, or 2 million. And the next question, how will you report to the regulator? Based on what have you paid this money to your customer in 3 seconds? What documents have you used? And then the Russian Rosfin monitoring, the monitoring agency, the oversight agency for various money transactions, will come and get you. Of course, it requires trust. Well, when it comes to tax authorities and the Rosfin monitoring, these agencies will of course be punished by themselves if they will let this transaction slip, if they will let this deal, like us giving the money in 3 seconds, slip. So of course it can't happen in an environment where nobody trusts anybody. I think it was a year before last when Elvira Nabiulina said, and of course we all got inspired, that an oversight can be based on principles and not on the letter of the law. And of course we are making steps towards this direction, and of course the trust in this room grows. But unfortunately, it's not the same case, it's not the same story with our law enforcing agencies. Now, coming to the question that you asked, Georgi, I think, gave a good answer to it. Stoically, he has to counteract the desire of the bankers to join to what we have done as the basic standard. And you know, we've been punished for it significantly. We have adopted a standard for life insurance, but the central bank decided that we were not too harsh, we were not too rigid, and they made their own standards. And of course, the insurance are the ones who are squeezed more than others. Well, you called us the biggest distribution network, right? And you see only 2 banks have joined to our standard on a voluntary basis. And one of those banks doesn't do life insurance, but we have 400 banks in the country. So either we do a system end-to-end, meaning that the self-regulatory principles are followed by everyone. There has to be a basic standard, a compulsory standard, the code of ethics, and of course everybody has to rigidly follow it. The insurers, the pensioners, the bankers, and so on and so forth. Or you give people an opportunity to do self-regulation, and then you move the self-regulation to a different category, ethical, behavioral, mobilizing people to do frank and fair behavior. I think you will definitely get it in the end of the day, because that's what historically is beneficial for everyone, but take the control functions to yourself. And please, don't be illusioned that when it comes to it, somebody will join to our standard voluntarily. It's either rigidly and forcibly, or completely on a voluntary basis, but then don't expect anyone to join. Thank you. Thank you. My question to Konstantin then. Now, pension funds. You know, there's been lots of buzz around the situation when the money of the pensioners was lost. Was a self-regulation a measure to counteract the situation? And what has to be done so that these issues were not, so to speak, cascaded to the regulator? Thank you very much for this amazing issue before the break. Sergey? If you want me to answer, I'm going to answer to you right away. No, it didn't help. I mean, the introduction of self-regulation didn't help. And I think it's a clear-cut fact. In our organization, we have a huge experience of being self-regulating. Actually, we believe ourselves to be self-regulating starting from 2002. And since this time, we have produced an enormous number of standards. And a lot have joined. Some organizations even did it on a voluntary basis. But before it became compulsory, I think we were treated, or the self-regulatory organization was treated as something superfluous. But there is another thing. There is a real contradiction between a self-regulatory organization, between the members inside the self-regulatory organization. I'm not even talking about those relations with customers. I'm talking about the relations between the players within the organization. So I don't think it helped, because the contradiction persisted. Well, of course, contradiction is the engine to every progress. It's the essence of dialectics. But those who pay more, I mean, those who issue more fees to the self-regulatory organization want to manage and govern the self-regulatory organizations more, of course. Every time we come and we try to punish for various malpractices and violation of good practices, people leave us. They just stand up and go. And we've been through that. So I personally believe that either self-regulation has to be based on a classical principle, whereas the government completely disposes of the control and oversight function, and what it controls is just the organization, the self-regulatory organization itself. Or, and here I fully agree with Igor, you have to give all the control functions to the state. And because you can't wear two hats at the same time. I don't know how about my other colleagues here and how they see the situation. We don't really want to punish our members too much, just because they pay us money. And this is true. And that's, of course, a contradiction. Now, talking about good things, let me be fair and frank. What you said showed us that the market doesn't trust each other. The markets do not trust each other. Because we were trying several times, we made this attempt to sit around one table, several players in the market, and thanks a lot to Elvira Nabiulina, she did recently on a very high level. I don't know where it will come to, because maybe her authority and maybe the fear to cause some disconcern of the regulator will play its role. But when we were trying to make this attempt and put all players in the market around one table, we heard the following. One player says, I will maybe go away from using one bad practice, but can you guarantee me that my neighbor is going to do the same? So I fully agree with what Igor says. Unless the Bank of Russia punishes you for bad practices, punishes, either giving you fines in a monetary way or doing something with your license, we're not going to solve the problem. So self-regulation is like a Catholic church. It trades indulgences and removes your sins, but it doesn't want to punish. Maybe it works differently in a different industry. Alexander, Yelena, can you share your experience? Thank you very much, Sergey. Let me give you an example of how credit organizations do self-regulation. And I will probably disagree with the previous speaker. He says that what we're focused on is just getting the money and taking the indulgence. Unfortunately, it has to be stated that many participants in the market treat self-regulation as something that you told about. It's a burden. You need to pay money and be left alone. But the experience of our self-regulatory organization have shown that quite often, initiated by the players themselves, we've agreed on removing bad practices even before basic standards were adopted. We did so when capping the interest rates. We did so when working with the so-called mother's capital and family capital vehicles. Our players of the market no longer treat the I think that it's not right that the players of the market or the participants of the market treat the self-regulatory organization as a superfluous entity. And I think some time has to be spent before a self-regulatory organization is treated not only as something exerting a control function, but also as something that exerts a lot of other functions, such as information accessibility, communication efforts, training, and awareness raising. So if the concept of self-regulation and delegated oversight is going to be seen through, I think the Bank of Russia will, in the end of the day, be able to produce a roadmap that will help to build a trust between the participants of the market and from the participants of the market towards the self-regulatory organization, so that some of the regulatory functions can be levied, can be taken away from the Bank of Russia, so that the community itself set up the rules of the game, control the rules of the game, and protected the good practices. Again, to ensure long-term development of the market. So when you say, what is trust? Is it costs or is it investments? I think it's investments. Hopefully your members think the same. Yelena, what's your position on that?
Today here I represent actually not just the microfinancial center that I work in, but I also represent here the association of the largest players in the market. We now control over 70% of all the loan portfolio in the specific market. Therefore, there is a certain responsibility. The standards that we have, they operate, although they've not been operating for that long in the full form, but we do punish. And from last year, we started to actually try to prevent and act to remove the reasons for the violations. Together, we bring together large and small players, and the reasons can be different depending on the size. For the smaller ones, it can be some ignorance, so we have to inform. For the larger players, they are most likely to be aware, but they cut corners because their business model abuses that, and we inform them directly and straight on that if your business model is based on this, you will have to change your business model. Also, for self-regulation, I think it's important to actually produce the internal core standards from within the industry, from within the association, because when people design them, they will be aware of whether they will be able to implement them, what the costs are going to be, and what the efficiency is going to be. And when they design and adopt that themselves, then compliance is at a different level altogether. I would also like to echo Alexander in highlighting our educational and consulting functions. And when we find violations, and the Bank of Russia won't do that, it's mostly us who do that. So when we see a violation, we know instantly what should change in the educational programs and what events can discuss this. And I think this is really what we can do best, and we have what we have most potential in. Thank you. Alexei, you created the self-regulatory model that now operates on the Russian market. You were the voice of the industry in dialogue with the government and the parliament. Are you happy with the product of your labor? How do you see the state of the self-regulating industry right now? I wanted to be an independent expert, rather, but now you've disclosed my role, and it will be clear why I'm defending the existing model. It is really so. It is up to our vision, and whatever malfunctions we see, I'd like to argue that it's mostly due to the specific institutional character of this or that self-regulating organization, the resources they have, the practices they have, the relationships and they have. I think this is an issue of growing industry, of a new thing in development, and the role of, I think the model of co-regulation, not deregulation, but co-regulation has demonstrated its efficiency. What Konstantin said, that they cannot regulate transitions, for instance. Yes, the state regulator can pick it up when the self-regulating organizations can handle an issue, and in most cases they can, and this really connects to the topic of trust at the foundation of our discussion today. We all want the financial market to function well, and we all motivated, both industry and the regulator are motivated to achieve that, to get rid of non-bona fide players. And it's best if we do it, we're most motivated to do it ourselves. The existing co-regulation model and behavioral supervision that we have is, I think, an efficient one. I'm worried by the discussions that want to remove that, and that want to move to deregulatory framework. I think the law that we have right now is an efficient one. It gives the organizations to really fully work towards building trust that we all need. I think that perhaps our association is the strongest out of the institutions that exist, or we're the strongest institution. We spend a lot for supervision. We've recently been actually checked in our performance by the central bank. We were very worried of how this will go. It was for me important to be assured that the central bank will really appreciate all the efforts we undertake in the field of supervision. And we'll see what the results of that inspection be like, but I think we agreed on most points, and I really welcome that we share the vision on the functions that we have, on the sanctions that we deploy, and I think in the overall positive vision on the existing model based on the inspection. I'm going to give the mic back in a sec, but just specific idea. The important thing is that we don't punish that much. We don't have high fines, maybe, although there have been actually a number of institutions actually excluded from our membership, and that de facto means that they will not be able to operate on the Russian market as a financial organization. But what we do, most importantly, is that we correct and adjust practices and behavior. Thank you. Konstantin said that they cannot really influence their members because they leave. They leave to Sergei Belekov. Maybe we should just have one association. Maybe we should reduce the number of the associations. What's your vision on that? Perhaps a note of discord in today's discussion is likely to happen now that I speak. Our experience and trust has meant for us responsibility vis-à-vis your customer, your partners, your peers within the institution. We here mostly represent banks. We mostly also have banks as members, so we really have the best representatives of the financial market in our association, and therefore we have a three-part approach to the behavioral standards. First is what we have fed from the central bank, and with that we operate very actively with Mikhail Valerievich, and now we work on the sales scripts to ensure that the individuals who acquire loans understand what they do. We want to separate this from consulting to make sure that the customer is aware. Another element is that what the market has offered themselves, when the market players come up with ideas that will allow them to compete from those who work in the so-called gray zone. This is self-regulating when you create the rules on the market themselves. And the third part of that is when we create practices based on specific cases. So there recently, 2 years ago, was a conflict between two players. We had the disciplinary committee meeting, and this didn't work out because this was not regulated by the legislation. We Thanks to personal connections, we had the 3 months negotiations, and after that, we signed a 3-party agreement, and the conflict was over. But after that, we decided to create an ethical standard. We now have it on our website. We were collecting comments for 6 months, and after that was implemented, it's now active as of 2018. We also have an ethical committee, which has in its midst very respected figures, and it applies to both full and associated members. Yesterday evening, we had a talk with my old friend Alexei Penforov, who's now at Sovcombank, and Alexei said that he said, I put it in capital letters where I work, that we don't sell bad products. This is the responsibility of the leaders who work in the bank industry, leaders in other subfields of our industry, who now aware that such behaviors will undermine their relationship with clients and undermine trust. Therefore, I believe that self-regulation is there. It works well, whether we have one association or more association. I think more is better because they have different angles, and you can learn from one another. I think having just one association is not an obvious solution. We could discuss that. Yesterday, self-regulation was also a part of the presentation by Ms. Nabiulina, and I'd like her to perhaps comment the discussion that we've had. Thanks very much. I have a number of ideas and a number of concerns based on this discussion. I've been listening to how we operate self-regulating organization, and the key questions was how behavior supervision will develop, and what I hear is that product sales is one of the key issues that is at the foundation of trust, whether self-regulation works or not. Well, if it doesn't, then Bank of Russia is ready to change for state regulation. We will not tolerate mis-selling and untrustworthy operations, because this disrupt trust for the rest of the market. Sometimes we really have to enforce industries to self-regulate. We just tell it straight on that if you don't resolve this, if you on your own, then we will be very harsh and regulate it ourselves. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. We would like regulatory structures to solve problems, to protect our shared industries, and they're long-term industries, not just short-term interest to earn now and then forget about your responsibility later on. But one concern that I hear from this discussion is that self-regulation works where we have many players of comparable size, and where there is the market force that drives them. Say you remove the membership of one microfinancial organization, but the rest are ready to move on. I'm more concerned in the fields where we have large, extremely large players who are stronger than the association and the self-regulatory body. And we have to think about a way to self-regulate together. If we can create a vision for strong self-regulatory associations, organizations, to actually enforce standards. You have to have the right to enforce in order to be able to consult and correct. Because if you don't have this stick, then you may not be as successful in your advisory practices. So I think we should discuss how this can work in banking, because in terms of insurance practices, I think we will just have to work faster. We cannot really wait for too long for the banking industry to join the standard. I give a year for discussions. We've been discussing this for a year now, and if the banking industry is not ready to start self-regulation, then we will have to step in. Once you're ready, we will delegate. Perhaps the market players won't be too happy for that, but we, as a mega regulator, are tasked by law to protect consumer rights, and we will do that. We therefore call upon the banking community and all other market players to come up with a working model of self-regulation, which will allow to remove the mis-selling and practices from the industry. We will accept it if you suggest an operating model. In order to have that, we will have to stick to the timeline, do it fast, and be responsible towards our consumer. Perhaps this has sounded harsh, but this is the concern that I've taken from the discussion. I think the diagnosis is clear, and we will have to move on from here, keeping in mind our shared responsibility, our joint responsibility. Thank you. Thanks. We're perfect in terms of timing. I have perhaps a couple of sentences of summary. Trust is important. We're ready to invest in building trust. The organic development is taking place, but it will take too long. Therefore, the regulator should help by using its authority and the resources that they have. Self-regulatory organizations should prove their efficiency in terms of supervision. In many countries, the heads of the self-regulating organizations are actually appointed by the mega regulator rather than elected from amidst the membership. This gives a different level of responsibility and gives authority to this leader in order to sometimes take and implement unpopular measures. And the third message, which we heard yesterday and we hear today again, is that the problems in the market that we see in the market will have to be resolved fast, and I hope that in Sochi at the forum we will have specific ideas. Georgi, for you, it's a great, I think, challenge for your organization. Good day to you all, and thank you for being here with us.